Don't do it. I was lying. Please don't." The audience, consisting almost entirely of men, tried not to show any emotion as they watched the half-naked, black-haired woman being tortured. "For God's sake, it's a mistake. I just made it all up. A terrible mistake. Help!" Her cries echoed around the whitewashed, sterile room. Her words were clearly intelligible. Nobody present would be able to claim later that they'd misunderstood her. The woman didn't want this. Despite her protests, the slightly overweight, bearded man with wonky teeth stuck the syringe into the crook of her strapped arm. Despite her protests, they didn't remove the electrodes attached to her forehead and temples, nor even the ring around her head, which reminded her of those unfortunate tortured monkeys in animal testing laboratories, their skulls opened and probes inserted into their brains, which basically wasn't so different from what was about to be done to her now. When the sedative and muscle relaxant began to take effect, they began manual ventilation. Then the men started administering the electrical impulses, 475 volts, 17 times in succession, until they triggered an epileptic fit. From the angle of the closed-circuit camera, it was impossible to tell whether the black-haired woman was offering resistance or whether her limbs were twitching spastically. The backs of the figures sporting aprons and face masks blocked the audience's view, but the screaming had stopped. Eventually, the film stopped too, and it became a little brighter in the hall. "What you have just witnessed is a shocking case." Dr. Emma Stein began her observations, breaking off briefly to pull the microphone a bit closer so the conference guests could hear her more clearly. Now she was annoyed she'd spurned the footstool the technician had offered her during the sound check. Usually she would have asked herself for one, but the guy in overalls had given her such a condescending grin that she'd rejected the sensible option of making herself taller. As a result, she was having to stand on tiptoe behind the lectern. A shocking case of coercive psychiatry which had long been thought consigned to history. Like Emma, most of those present were psychiatrists, which meant she didn't have to explain to her colleagues that her criticism wasn't leveled at electroconvulsive therapy. Conducting electricity through a human brain might sound terribly medieval, but it produced promising results in combating psychoses and depression. Performed on a general anesthetic, the treatment had virtually no side effects. "We managed to smuggle this footage captured by a surgery monitoring camera from the Orfilio Clinic in Hamburg. The patient whose fate you've just witnessed was committed on the 3rd of May last year, diagnosed with schizoid psychosis, based solely on what the 43-year-old herself said upon admission. But there was nothing wrong with her at all. The supposed patient faked her symptoms." "Why?" a faceless individual from someone in the middle of the hall and to her left asked. The man practically had to shout for her to understand him in the theater-like space. The German Association of Psychiatry had hired for its annual conference the main hall of the International Congress Center in Berlin. From the outside, the ICC resembled a silver space station, which from the infinite expanses of the universe had spun to a halt directly beneath the television tower. And yet when you entered this 70s building, which was possibly contaminated with asbestos, experts disagreed about this, you were reminded less of science fiction and more of a retro film. Chrome, glass, and black leather dominated the interior. Emma allowed her gaze to roam across the packed rows of chairs, but unable to locate the questioner talked in the vague direction she imagined him to be. "Here's a question of my own. What does the Rosenhahn experiment mean to you?" An older colleague, sitting in a wheelchair at the edge of the front row, nodded knowingly. It was first performed at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s with the aim of testing the reliability of psychiatric prognoses. As ever when she was nervous, Emma twisted a strand of her thick, teak-brown hair around her left index finger. She hadn't eaten anything before her lecture, for fear of feeling tired or needing to burp. Now her stomach was rumbling so loudly that she was worried the microphone might pick up the noise, lending further fuel to the jokes she was convinced were going around about her fat bum. In her eyes, the fact that she was otherwise quite slim only highlighted this bodily imperfection. Broom up top, wrecking ball below, she'd thought again only this morning when examining herself in the bathroom mirror.